And I think we are now recording. And I'm admitting 3 new people into the room. Yeah, okay. So we are now recording, and Richard, I'll pass things over to you.
Good. Well, welcome everybody. As most of you know, I'm Richard Hayes, the chair of the Social Justice Committee and co-chair of the Racial Justice Team, along with Diane Narkunis. And, you know, we've been working on this racial justice and combating systematic racism in our culture for several years. We've brought to you as a team, we've brought to the congregation varied programs, including sermons by Reverend Rue and by Reverend David Messner. We've had multiple forums. We've had book group discussions on white superiority, white privilege, systematic racism in our culture. At the same time, our Charleston Area Justice Ministry team, CAJM, has been actively tackling systematic racism in the Low Country. We've been supporting our African-American CAJM leaders tackling such issues as police racial bias, affordable housing, jailing of juvenile delinquents, and suspension issues in the public schools. So our Black, Indigenous, and people of color brothers in our Unitarian Universalist faith asked that we respond in a bold way to combat racism and white supremacy. And our racial justice team believes that we're ready to act with accountability as we work alongside other congregations, always journeying towards spiritual wholeness, called to dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions as we continue to work to build this beloved community, first talked about by Martin Luther King. So let me read to you the 8th principle, and it was recommended by the Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism. And just listen. We, the member congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association, covenant to affirm and promote journeying towards spiritual wholeness by working to build a diverse, multicultural, beloved community by our actions that accountably dismantle racism and other oppressions in ourselves and our institutions. Now, this may not be the final wording, as the UUA has a process for updating our principles. And it started 2 years ago when they commissioned the Article 2 Study Commission. It's been formed, and it includes Paula Cole-Jones, who really gave birth to this 8th principle in that Black UU group, and she co-wrote it, and she's on the Article 2 Commission. This commission is set to make a recommendation to the UUA board in January of 2022. That's this coming January. And this recommendation then could most likely be voted on at the next General Assembly in 2022, which is exactly 12 months.
Oops. All right. Sorry, Richard, hold a second. Richard, can you unmute? Sorry.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Is my sound bad, or are we quiet?
Now we're good.
Yeah, sorry, Richard, I cut you off. But
when did you cut me off at?
About 30 seconds ago.
You were talking about the General Assembly, that it was going up for General Assembly vote in 2022.
Great. Thanks a lot. Okay, so it's going up for General Assembly in 2022, and then if the vote is positive, it will come up again in 2023. You need 2 years of votes in the General Assembly to make any change final. It's very likely that the content of the 8th principle will be in this recommendation. We're not sure, and we know we're not even sure what the format may be. At 1GA was either last year or the year before, they even talked about putting the words of this 8th principle in the preamble to the overall principles. So while it's being discussed at General Assembly, and we're a bit away from the vote, about 12 months, many groups are involved, the congregations will be pulled back into it as well. But this all takes this time, and that's why congregations like ours have been encouraged to pass their own 8th principle, while the UUA goes through the required democratic process of review and discussion and introduces a bylaw revision. So next week, let me read to you the motion that the Vestry Board is going to put to you that we will vote on. the vestry board moves that the Unitarian Church in Charleston adopt the 8th principle as part of the guiding ethical framework of our church. Adopting this principle means that we will publicly promote our commitment to this principle, take appropriate action to support anti-racism, incorporate its work into the execution of our strategic plan, and hold ourselves internally and externally accountable to its vision. Adopting this principle also means that our selected delegates for the UUA General Assembly will support broader adoption of the principle within the UUA. And then we'll go on to read the 8th principle, which I've already read to you. So now the rest of the team will give you more details on why we, your racial justice team, are recommending that we all support this vestry board motion next week. So next up is my racial justice team co-chair, Diane Narkunis.
Diane, you probably need to unmute yourself.
Thank you, both of you. I'm going to address why now? This is a question often asked by UU congregations contemplating the formal adoption of the UUA's 8th principle that articulates a commitment backed by action to dismantle white supremacy within the stated principles of our UU faith. UU funding and focus in the last decade shifted toward shallow diversity rather than deep multicultural, beloved community and structural change. UU support of Black Lives Matter has been encouraging as a first step. However, the best way for us to truly support racial justice in a significant way is to purge ourselves and our institutions of the culture and exclusive practice of whiteness and white supremacy. We need to be creative to accomplish this. We are constantly bombarded with news of police violence against people of color. Most recently, the January 5th killing of Jamal Sutherland, a mentally ill African-American at the hands of 7 officers from the Sheriff's Department. Supreme Court decisions on voting rights and affirmative action, along with the election of Trump and his followers, particularly in local state elections, have provided support to white supremacists and indicates that the country is moving quickly and dangerously in the wrong direction. I wanted to make this personal. I would like to share with you 2 personal experiences I've had with racial injustice and racial discrimination from a multicultural perspective. Maria, a friend originally from Ecuador, is undocumented, but now on a path to citizenship. 5 years ago, her daughter Jessica, at age 15, received a late diagnosis of stomach cancer that took her life a year later. If she had access to primary care, she could be alive today. Also, MUSC initially did the surgery, but would not continue providing care. She was then provided to Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York City for further treatment. Jessica's parents quit their jobs and stayed with relatives in New York City for a year, almost losing their home. As a member of the CAGM Healthcare Steering Committee, our research has shown that people of color often do not have access to primary care and end up in hospital emergency rooms with advanced health problems that can lead to death. My granddaughters, who some of you may remember, they haven't been here for a long time, Lily and Marie, who live near Seattle, Washington. At the ages of 10 and 13 years of age, they have fear of verbal and physical abuse because they are half Asian. Because the mainstream media in that area does not often report abuse against Asians, they turn to blogs to keep up with areas where they need to avoid. As a grandmother, this hurts my heart because Asians do not feel comfortable reporting verbal and physical abuse to police. The statistics are greater than we know. Our congregation has made strides towards building a responsible community, both within our church community and by joining people of color in seeking social justice for the marginalized in our area. I believe we can build on these actions within our church and do more. The 8th principle encourages us to build multicultural, beloved community by our actions that can accountably dismantle racism. To be honest, I love the term beloved community, but I didn't really understand the definition. So the definition within the UUA principle website reads, a beloved community happens when people of diverse races, ethnic, educational, class, gender, sexual orientation, backgrounds, and identities come together in an interdependent relationship of love, mutual respect, and care that seeks to realize justice within our community and elsewhere in the world. I want this for my beloved UU Church community in Charleston, and I want it now.
Thank you, Diane. And I believe next we're moving to Suzanne. Is that right? Suzanne, are you ready? If you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, I am unmuting, and there we go. Keeps muting me back. I wonder if that's a message for the morning. Good morning, everyone. Having not been part of organized religion in my adult life, I joined the UU because of our espoused values, that because justice is at the core of our faith. I researched the history of Unitarians putting our faith into action, and I saw our proud legacy of civil rights activism, and that we identify as a community of deeds, not creeds. Now, I love that about us. It was and still remains very important to me in my choice to be a UU. I myself have personally progressed from an armchair activist with, fighting for racial justice in spirit to being deeply involved in walking the talk of justice. And I do this especially through CAJM. Now, with specific regard to the UU, I yearn to see our whole UU even more fully engaged in taking action on our values. Our 7 principles are inspiring and they espouse the right sentiments, yet they don't spur us to action. They don't hold us accountable to be our values. For example, the first principle affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person, but doesn't call us to specifically address white supremacy, racism, and other oppressions that are destructive of human worth and dignity. Sadly, the first principle has existed for many years, and yet racism persists within our own minds, our congregations, and our families. Just think about that. Have we acted sufficiently to drive out those oppressions and prejudices? Further, our current 7 principles do not call us to address the particular urgency of now. That is, as Diane mentioned, the new Jim Crow actions, police violence against people of color, Supreme Court decisions on voting rights, the election of Trump with his advisors and et cetera, all supporting white supremacists. All of these show our country moving quickly and dangerously in the wrong direction. I think the world needs us UUs to take strong leadership to reverse these trends. We can't armchair protest or look at others to take on our systems and governments when they're not doing the right thing by our citizens. We need our whole congregation actively engaged in dismantling these offenses against our humanity, and our dignity. So I see that our existing 7 principles are certainly necessary, but they're not sufficient for us to live lives that have justice at our core. Our 7 principles imply this 8th principle, but they don't explicitly hold us accountable for addressing the oppressions directly and especially systemically. It's the 8th principle that does that for us. So I fully support adding the 8th principle to our UU statement of values. And I acknowledge that it's really just the beginning of action, not the ultimate goal. It comes from the sense that we need something to renew our commitment to do racial justice work, to hold ourselves accountable, and to fulfill the potential of the existing principles. It calls us to action to stand up for people who are oppressed and to crush white supremacy. It calls us to make our actions match our values, for us to walk the talk of social justice and human dignity. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and Diane and Richard as well before you. So my little section is supposed to be addressing the why here. Why is this particular principle important for us, specifically at the Unitarian Church in Charleston, and I would say in Charleston and in South Carolina? Diane talked about the range of racial difference in the United States and the ways in which race affects different people from all walks of life. and prevents them from enjoying full human development and the full wealth of the United States. My section is why here, and that has to do not with the now, but with the past, which, as we all know, living in Charleston is never over, in the most historic city in the United States as it builds itself. And so we have to think about the specifics, I think, in Charleston, South Carolina, of American race relations, and the peculiar division in American conceptualization of two races, and the division into white and non-white. I'm still occasionally surprised, but also not surprised, to hear people or students talking about the two races, for instance, which is a very weird idea. We're living here in Charleston, in the birthplace of African America. Charleston is very rarely billed as the birthplace of African America. It's billed as all sorts of other things, but very rarely that. But it should be that. It's somewhere between 40 and 50% of all of the enslaved Africans who were brought to continental North America came through the port of Charleston. Peter Wood, the historian, writing about South Carolina as a Black majority space, writes about Charleston as being the Ellis Island of the United States. I put a more somatic twist on things, and I say, actually, you can think of Charleston Harbor as the painful birth canal of African America. If you think of the vast Atlantic as a kind of great pregnant womb, and all of these seeds of African America are funneled finally into continental North America through the narrow birth canal that is Charleston Harbor, I think you can think of the birthplace of African America as a place of great potential, but also of enormous pain. So that's where we are. We live in Charleston, this birthplace of African America. But how did this birthplace become the birthplace also of racism? Well, what it did, it took Africans, African people, and turned them into slaves. And then when slavery was under pressure, it turned those slaves into Black people. And Blacks were slaves because they were Black, and slaves were Black. It became a vicious cycle, so that even after the end of slavery, African Americans, Black people, became second-class citizens. And they've remained so as a result of all sorts of other consequences that we've seen in Charleston, South Carolina: redlining, legal segregation, voter deregistration, and so on and so forth. And that is the legacy that we live with right here in Charleston. Every single brick we look at, every single street we walk is marked by that particular history of race and racial suppression. Way back in about 1988-89, Toni Morrison, now a Nobel Prize winning author, obviously dead, but at that time she had not won the Nobel Prize. She was still blazing a trail for African-American women writers. She wrote a book called Beloved about slavery at the end of the 1850s in the United States. And she was interviewed by the UU World at that time. And they were asking why she'd written that book. And she said that there was nowhere to go for Black people. There was no place to go to think about what slavery might have meant, what slavery might have felt like for people. There wasn't a skyscraper, there wasn't a building, there wasn't even, she said, a bench by the road. And so in 2007, the first bench by the road, so that's already 20 years after she'd made that comment, we placed the very first bench by the road on Sullivan's Island at the Fort Moultrie National Park Service Place. It's still incredibly easily missed. Here in our own church, we have a very small monument too, using the bricks that had probably been made by enslaved African-American hands, and that is there. And those two very missable monuments are all that we have in Charleston, paying attention, paying homage to the work and the labor of those African-Americans who built the city that we live in. So we have a massive backlog to overcome. Monumentally, Charleston is a hymn to white power, white money, white capital, white success, white achievement. But it's actually all on the back of our Black population, who is still underrepresented and massively held at economic disparity. So we have a huge task to overcome that to turn those tiny benches by the road and the little monument that we have in our churchyard into something which truly represents and reflects the achievement and the wonderful, wonderful power of African Americans. So I think this is of all churches in all of the United States, this is the church that needs to pass this particular principle. Thanks.
So before I move on, I just want to so we're like a little ways in, I want to pause and like breathe in how beautiful and brilliant my colleagues are here. I just am sitting here happy to be a part of this congregation that I love so much, and happy to be doing this work alongside those of you who have spoken. So we've heard kind of what the eighth principle is, where it comes from, why it's important for us to adopt it now, and why here specifically in Charleston. The question that I'm going to address in short is, why these words? In other words, like the specific words of the eighth principle, because I think for a lot of folks, and I consider myself a bit of a poet and a writer myself. For a lot of us, the first thing that maybe stands out when you look at the eighth principle is, wow, that's really wordy compared to the other 7 principles. And so I think for a lot of us, the first question that we have is, well, why these words in particular? And so some of what I want to say is going to echo things that have already been said, but I think that first things first, I think it's really important for us to remember that as we're approaching this congregational vote, as we're approaching voting on the motion that Richard put in the chat box, it's important to remember that we're not voting as a congregation on whether we should draft an anti-racist principle. Like, we're not voting as a congregation on whether we should create our own statement about anti-racism. In effect, what we're doing is we're voting on whether we want to join in a movement that has been afoot in our kind of association, our religious community nationwide, and that has been afoot for a few years now. So as we've heard, the words were drafted by UUs who are engaged in anti-racist activism. And so I think part of the challenge for us, particularly for us, as an overwhelmingly white congregation in what is an overwhelmingly white association, I think part of the challenge for us is to listen and to follow the folks who've been engaged in this activism nationwide, before we move to an instinct of, well, can we edit it? Can we alter it? Can we offer track comments and changes, right? Paula Cole Jones, herself a Black Unitarian leader, initiated this process and helped draft the principle. Black Lives of Unitarian Universalism has endorsed it and advocates for its adoption. And I just want to name that kind of Black Lives of UU is really part of an even bigger national movement and moment, right? The Black Lives Matter movement. We are living through the most significant and sustained movement for racial justice this country has seen since the civil rights era. We are kind of living in the great revolution of our day and age. So I do think that it's worth pausing and even sitting perhaps in a little, discomfort, to say that following the leadership of our fellow Black, Indigenous, and people of color UUs is important. I think that the voices of our Black UUs and other UUs of color matter, and I think that listening to them matters too. Now, Suzanne said a little bit about this, and Reverend Dave is going to expand, but I will pause very briefly to say I do actually think the words matter. I think that saying explicitly that we are going to accountably dismantle racism is different than saying it implicitly. So I actually think that the words do matter, but Suzanne spoke to that, and Reverend Dave is going to speak to that a little bit more too. I think the last thing I'll simply say, and I actually think that this is maybe the most important thing that we can say about the words, is that more than anything else, when we approach the congregational vote in a week, I think that what we should approach it as is whether we as a congregation are willing to adopt this principle in spirit, rather than thinking about adopting a particular set of words, right? As Richard said, the specific set of words may change at the UUA level in the next 1 to 2 to 3 years. The bigger question for us is whether we as a congregation are willing to state explicitly that we are willing to do the work of accountably dismantling racism and oppression. That's ultimately what this is about. And I love that phrase that Suzanne gave us, right? Deeds, not creeds, right? Are we willing to explicitly state and actively promote and deeply engage in dismantling racism and oppressions in ourselves and in our congregation? So, and Richard gave this in a previous meeting, so this is a quote from someone else, but I think that the question to us really is, what would it say about us as a congregation, as Unitarian Universalists, if we didn't vote to adopt this principle, right? I have more thoughts. I could talk and talk and talk, but I'm going to pass it over to Reverend Dave now, and I'm just grateful for all of you here.
Thank you, everyone. You so eloquently put forward all of the important ideas. I'm mindful of a couple. I'm going to limit my speech to 2 minutes so we can have the first half of this forum on sharing. Forgive me, I'm also looking in the wrong direction. For technical reasons, the screen where my camera is dark. Your beautiful faces are over here. So I'm going to condition myself to stare into the darkness so you can see my face. And then you'll have conversation. I'm going to cut out to go actually preach from the pulpit today. I want to say something that hooked me. I wrestle a lot with like what the standing and meaning is of this set of principles in a non-creedal church. This today, like literally today, is the 60th anniversary of the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalist Church in America. This is that moment. And at that time of merger, there was this instinct to say, what are we about? And it's funny because the headline read Unitarians, right? We're about wrestling with the Trinity. Really? Nobody was wrestling with the Trinity in 1961 among our people. Not nobody, but that wasn't what was heated. Universalism, who's getting into heaven, who's going to hell? Similarly, 1961 was not the main concern. Social progressivism and transformation of the world we live in was the uniting concern that said, hey, we are in the same place. We're trying to speak for the rights of people. We're trying to be justice builders. And we're trying to say that our faith is deeply grounded in that human goodness and human possibility. So I've long ago come to terms with not wordsmithing and not worrying. I have a kind of legalistic brain. And so I have my own versions. You know, when I teach, I only teach 3 principles right now anyway, because people can't remember 7. Dignity, freedom, interdependence. Again and again, theologically, I want to say that's what we're about. Human dignity, human freedom, and the fact that we're part of one family. So we have accountability for each other. This 8th principle is more important to me than many of the other ones, because then we take those 3 theological principles, which are ideas, ontological ideas about our existence, and we transform it into so what? So what are we going to do with those insights? That we're good people, that we're equally good people, that we're bound together, and that we have power. That point about freedom doesn't mean you don't tell me what to do. It means I have individual power, as opposed to some old visions of God as puppet master. Like, what? I don't know, this is the way to work. No, we can make a difference. That 8th principle is the answer to those 3 principles, which is, what are you going to do with the power you've been given? We are going to dismantle oppression. we have thousands of years of systems of oppression that separate those who have from those who have not. And privilege means that you get fed at the expense of others. And these oppressions are, in this country, race was profoundly the tool, as Professor Lewis was talking about. I mean, and we systematically wielded it as a tool to maintain that sort of bifurcation of dignity. But we've done it in other ways too. I can't give a whole sermon out. You know, we don't like poor people in this country. That's the whole sermon. We really just don't like poor people. And so the socioeconomic oppressions in this country are profound. And I speak as a rich person. We don't historically like women. And we benefit off the backs of the free labor of women. And we do everything to make that a perpetuable system in the future. The list goes on and on. So when we talk about dismantling these systems of oppression and what we talk about as structural sin, we are the people who long ago said, we are not born into sin as individuals. Don't tell me about Adam and Eve and something. That's not what we believe. But if we don't see the structural sin of a system that privileges a few of us where we eat plenty and others who bear it on their backs and bring it to our table. So I feel so energized about it. I don't give a whit about the language of it. I think we need to make a claim about the purpose of our faith and its call to action. So let's go.
Great, thank you, Reverend Dave. And unfortunately, we've, of course, given too much of this forum over to preachers and to professors who cannot stop talking, and we've gone way over time. We were supposed to have 2 or 3 minutes each, and we're over 10:30 already, so it's left very little time for discussion. And Kay's already said, you know, can't we hear some counter voices? And I think we were initially trying to respond to some of the questions that, you know, maybe this thing isn't necessary, and then the other question, maybe the wording is wrong. But please, let's just hand it over to folks to chime in now and ask some questions. And certainly please feel uncoerced. This is not the point of this to coerce people, but it really was, in fact, to address some implicit questions initially. But fire away, please, folks. Kay, do you want to go first, or are you? Is that putting you too much on the spot? You'll have to unmute. Unmute, Kay. Unmute, Kay.
There, okay. There's so much going on in my mind as we talk about this. Plus, I keep pulling up this 8th principle in the chat box, which isn't too comfortable, but it seems to me maybe we are trying to jump the gun with this a little bit and to do a field cover every little.
Okay, you're really not clear. Maybe can you just type something into the chat really concisely? Because your audio is breaking up. Certainly for me, I don't know for other people. Yeah, Kay, we can't hear you.
Maybe have her turn off her video and see if that helps.
All right. Well, I'll tell you what, Kay, if you can put something in the chat. Meantime, I'm going to go to Nancy, who's got a hand up.
I'll do that.
Oh, that came through clearly. Nancy, have a go, though.
Yes. Yeah. Hi there, everybody. First of all, my goodness, congratulations to all of us and all of you and Richard Hayes. Wow, you've done a great job, full year and more of organizing these things, and the committee as well. Kudos to the Social Justice Committee. I'm just in awe. I also saw you posted on Facebook the video from the Unitarian minister in Boise, Idaho. Fabulous. Everybody needs to see that. You all know me by now. I've been here 30 years. I like to think I am not a contrarian. Bear with me. I got to talk here. I'm not a contrarian. However, I have concerns, and here's my concern. Let me be very blunt. I remember the merger. I didn't realize it was today. I was born and bred a Universalist. You all know this. Let me ramble for a bit. I was in graduate school when the principles came about. My issue is not with race. I am on board. Sign me up for the work we need to do. I will do the work. My issue is UU principles as a creed. I'm sorry, I've always felt that way. That is my issue. So hearing everybody, hearing the good work, absolutely, Charleston of all churches needs to vote this in. My concerns are principles as creed. That's the main thing. My concern is also, is this performative? Wonderful wording. I'm not the wordsmithing. That's not the issue. So principles as creed. Number 2, is this performative? Number 3, let's stop yakking about this and do the work. Thank you.
Thanks. Kay, can we try going back to you perhaps, and then to John, who I see has got his hand up?
Okay,
Give it a try.
there we are. Now can you hear me? I
Yes.
stopped the video.
Yeah.
Yes, all right. What is worrying me is the wordiness of this 8th principle. We surely can't need all of those words to say where it is we want to go with this. I think Reverend Dave hit on the real source of our problems, not only in the US, but all over the world, which is, of course, the devotion to money and the idolization of those who make lots of it, no matter whether they act as good people or not. And so this is what I'd like to see us writing in our Unitarian principles, if we must add another one. I'm with Nancy on that. But that we act to dismantle a system that reveres the acquisition of money and things, because that's what really was the backbone of racism in the United States. Slaves were brought here to help others make lots of money. And that is what is the backbone of the systemic racism that we still see. When we keep people out of certain neighborhoods, we use the reason that our neighborhoods will lose their home values if you allow other groups in. So it always comes back to the funds. And that's where we as Unitarians need to take our stand. And that goes all the way back to Jesus Christ, of course, who overthrew those money lenders in the temple. It was all about the money, still is. Thank you.
Thanks, Kay. I'm going to go to John Yamlagovich, and then after that, we will go to Mary Ellen Geis, and then to Diane Boyer.
Hey, thank you, Simon. And similar to Nancy, I really do appreciate the work of the smaller group that has been so intensely focused on this. And I guess, unlike Nancy, I don't mind being called a contrarian a lot of times. And she and I called each other that a lot, I bet, I think. But I'm having a little bit of the same reaction. And I think that, and I see John Narkunis's comment about coercement, and I agree with him. And I don't know that Kay was necessarily saying that in the same sense of the word that I first heard her say it, but I do feel like I think some of my thoughts and things that I would have really liked to have asked questions about were precluded, not just anticipating that they may be raised, but here's the answer and let's just get on with it. That's where we are. So if you can't be there, then don't worry about it. This is where we are anyway. And I think my concerns are similar to Nancy's. I grew up in a church. They come from a different place though. I grew up in a church where there were certain songs you sang. I could recite both the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed. I memorized the entire Christmas story out of the Bible. And every year for 7 or 8 years at Christmas gatherings in my family, I did the Christmas story from memory. we're approaching this point where, well, if it's not important enough to make the list of 8, then does it not matter? And I'm also speaking a little bit as a gay person. I saw our church move on gay issues, not as quickly as I would like to have seen it happen, but it was all under the inherent worth and dignity. And I guess in some ways, I see, if you want to get really questionable about it, this is one of these conversations that, you know, we have a lot of times in corporate and public service America about, well, are you stating a strategy, or or a goal or a tactic? And I almost see our 8th principle becoming, you know, it's actually a somewhat plan of action to accomplish, as Dave was saying, some of the more theologically or ontologically oriented principles. Then we get into, do we have a creed? Should I memorize the creed? So I am completely on board with our voting for this. I think, especially as you're talking about the symbolism of being in Charleston, South Carolina, and not just the symbolism, the factual matters that are associated with us as being part of Charleston, South Carolina, it's important. But I do think words matter. And I'm concerned about placing this as a principle, and I'm concerned with the fact that it is, whenever you first read it, especially if you're not a Unitarian Universalist, I don't know that you really understand anything that was said in it. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Diane Boyer, you're up next, in fact. Unmute, please.
I thought Mary.
Yeah, no, she's opted out.
Oh, okay. Well, my reaction at first was the wordiness as well. I certainly wouldn't have let a graduate student get away with a sentence like that, but I've kind of moved beyond that, although I do think that if this gets to the outside world, we need to be a little clearer, maybe more succinct about what we're getting at here. But I think my assumption is that this will pass with our congregation, although I was on the vestry when the slave memorial was built, and that was not unanimously supported within our congregation at that time. So I'm not a very deep or philosophical thinker at all. I'm much more of a pragmatic person. You know, here's a problem, what can we do to fix it? I'm a little overwhelmed by Kay's suggestion that we dismantle not only racism, but our focus on the value of money in our culture. It all seems very overwhelming to me, but assuming that this is adopted, what does this mean for our congregation? Has there thought been given among the people who've been working on this? What is the next step? Will we have an 8th principle task force? I mean, we're already pretty active in CAGM. You know, that's my question now. What are we going to do to implement this if we say that, yes, we do believe that this should happen?
I think Matthew's probably got an answer to that. I think that's one of the things we talked about actually in our pre-game meeting, was thinking that actually this principle is one that really comes after the fact rather than the other way around, that this is actually the actions that we've been taking are already in some way saying they're based on the principle, even though the principle doesn't exist. So I think we were feeling quite confident about this principle because we were doing the work that is actually implied by the principle. But anyway, Matt, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I don't have an answer. You billed me that was too high of a billing, because an answer is a dangerous thing. But I think 2 thoughts that jumped to mind immediately. So to John's point, you know, the comparison about our being a welcoming community to the LGBTQ community. I think Simon made it in the planning meeting, but someone made the point that the fact that we have that flag up on our fence means something, not just to us, but means something to the community, right? That the community knows that this is a welcoming community for LGBTQ folks. And in a place like Charleston, that's especially important. And so so one action might be, and I think Reverend Dave even explicitly mentioned the idea of somehow having a banner, but like that one of the ways, we've been doing, as Simon just said, we've been doing this work. So it's not kind of like manufacturing, like, oh, well, now we're going to do racial justice work. We've been doing racial justice work, and this is a way of being explicit about that. But the other thought that it's less an answer as it is kind of passing the buck a little bit, but having met with Reverend Rebecca, she was really excited to hear that we as a congregation have been thinking about adopting the 8th principle and having conversations like this one for a while. And she herself is someone who is really excited about this movement at the association level. So this is not to give an answer so much as to say that I think Reverend Rebecca might have ideas about, what that would look like as a congregation after she gets here, because I do think the first thing to say, as Diane and Suzanne have already said, is like, we've been doing this work, not just in CAJM, but in a variety of things. So part of it is kind of saying it more explicitly and kind of promoting it more actively. But I will be interested, and I'm just excited for her to arrive. I'll be interested to hear what Reverend Rebecca, how she would imagine what this would look like if we do adopt it as a congregation in a week.
Thanks, Matt. Kay's put in the chat, we took the low road with the banner when we hesitated to put up the Black Lives Matter flag at the onset. But Suzanne had her hand up, so I'm going to go to Suzanne Hardy.
Just a quick one. I think more than just we're already, and I don't think Matt meant this, but then we're already doing the work, so it's business as usual. I think it's also an opportunity and really an invitation for all of us who have been involved to be more involved. For those of us, we're a big church. Not everyone is fully engaged in the work of dismantling these oppressions. What's the invitation we have for them? How do we embrace more people and the opportunities to get involved? And maybe they're different than the activities we have going on now, but it's easy to be part of a group and let a few of them carry on the work, and to be people in the stands versus people on the court. We have the opportunity to invite more people to be on the court playing the game with all of us, and I hope that we'll take that opportunity.
It's already got to 10:49 and Reverend Dave has left the building. So anybody want to have a last word here? Kay, John, Nancy, Diane, Al, Finch, maybe anybody? Nancy, you wanted to say something? No, I just put a thumbs up. Okay. Well, that may be it then.
Hey, Simon, I guess what I wanted to say was, I would like to see us consciously affirm and covenant to become a little more radical, to go to things right away and to act on them, and not sit around and talk and write more principles. But I appreciate what we do. I couldn't find this anywhere else.
Yeah, true. And I hope actually if we have this in the principle, it will commit us to it, especially with that word accountability in the, because that's actually it's the only principle, as far as I'm aware, that actually has that idea of accountability. All the other ones are very highfalutin, highbrow kinds of ideas, but this one says accountability. You got to do it.
Yes.
So if we have it, maybe that'll really force us to do it. Richard, was that a wave or a hand up?
It was a hand up. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming, and I especially want to thank Simon, who has done an amazing job as our MC here. He's done a very good job.
Yeah.
And I just want to thank all of you, and we'll take all your comments in, and come join our team, and we will have work to do. Thank you.
Yeah.
And indeed, no meeting for the forum next week because it's the congregational meeting, but there are 2 more forum sessions, at least one of which really is pertinent to this. On May the 30th, we've got David Keeley, who is an activist for healthcare for all, who's going to be talking about Medicare and Medicaid expansion in South Carolina. So that absolutely applies to the racial disparities in healthcare delivery in South Carolina and Charleston. So please come along for that on May the 30th. And then on June the 6th, we have Glenn Smith from the Post and Courier coming. He's the person who's coordinating their Uncovered series, which is looking at local corruption, something that I think often flies under the radar here. But again, is absolutely geared to maintaining the old boy system, which is essentially bolstering systems of white supremacy and getting in the way of full human development for all South Carolina citizens. So that's June the 6th, Glenn Smith from the Post and Courier. Same bat time, same bat station. Till then.
Thank
farewell.
you all.
Thank you very much indeed, everybody.
Thank you.